Hi there, I'm Jim with Twisted Hobbies, and today we're building the Crack Pitts. Here are the tools that I use for a regular build. First, we're going to start with a precision screwdriver set, some precision pliers, a cutter, X-Acto blade, measuring devices, a pin vise, O-ring installer tool, lots of adhesives. We've got some hot glue as well, some tape, a lighter for heat shrinking, some parchment paper for gluing on top of, and my transmitter and my Crack Series Pro power combo. We'll be using this to bind our receiver and verify motor direction and servo centering and ESC calibration as well. The one thing I didn't mention was a cordless drill, but other than that, this is what I use. Okay, let's get started. I've printed out my manual so that I don't get glue all over my computer or iPad. And now we're going to be folding over the wings and the ailerons and the rudder. And while we're doing that, and we're going to let them sit for about an hour or so. So let's set up the electronics while we wait for that. Okay, I've got my setup ready to go. I haven't bound this to my controller yet, but I do have a blank model in there ready to go. I'm going to go into my model settings and go down to bind once I've plugged in my battery. Make sure that my ID is unique, and you'll hear some beeping, and it binds. Once it's bound and I get a standard startup sound, I'm going to unplug it, take off the bind clip, and now I'm going to calibrate the ESC. So to do that, we're going to bring our power all the way up, plug it back in, and then you'll hear a series of beeps. And then you bring your throttle all the way down, and then you'll hear a standard startup sound once again. Verify that all my servos are working. This is a time to check to make sure that they're centered. Next, we're going to check the rotation of the motor and make sure it's going counterclockwise. I put some tape on it just to make it visually easier to see, and it's hard to tell in the video, but it is going clockwise. So I do need to unplug this and then change up two of the wires for the motor, and that will change the direction of the motor. I'll plug it back in and verify that I did that right. And now it's going counterclockwise, just like we wanted to. Everything's working. Great! Now all my electronics are set up and ready to install. And I'll just unplug this and put it away for later. We're going to start with the horizontal fuselage, removing all the inner tab pieces. And we're going to mate it up with the tail section. You'll notice that there's a little key that sort of keeps you from doing it the wrong way around. That's the wrong way. There we go, that's the right way. I was going to glue it, but then I was like, wait, I should probably have my parchment paper underneath here, so I put that under. Got some foam tack onto it. I really enjoy the foam tack as far as adhesives go. I've used CA on builds, I've used foam tack, I've used BSI foam cure, all sorts of them, but foam tack seems to be a pretty good one for me. So we've got the now vertical fuselage that we're cutting in half and taking out all those little pieces. I save all these little pieces. That way if you end up with something, oh, that little piece there that's inside, that's important. The manual doesn't show that you need it. And I actually put it away because I thought that I was not going to need it. So I saved it in my little baggie. But you do need that. That's your little tail skid. So I'm mating the vertical fuselage with the horizontal fuselage, getting it all plumb making sure it's square. Lots and lots of measuring and squishing together. I'm sorry about the color shifting for the white balance on this. I had some issues with my camera. It'll be better on the next build, I promise. Then we put on our fuselage stiffeners. And I wasn't quite sure how far back to put these, so I just lined them up with the end of the rudder where the elevator lines up. And it seemed to work well there. I glued this all the way down. I wouldn't necessarily recommend gluing it all the way down. You might leave the end off just a little bit, and you'll see why. Because I go to put this through, and then I was like, uh-oh, I glued the whole thing shut. So I'm trying to shove this wire into that tunnel, and I messed around with some tweezers for a while until I realized that I just needed to go grab a piece of wire and pull it all the way through. I did that, but if you just didn't glue it down until after this, then that would probably work just as well. So I fished that wire through, and then I just continue to push together the surfaces for the foam tack, and then we'll do the top half of the vertical fuselage. And with the foam tack, I really like working with it because you can just continue to squish it together as the glue is drying. Making sure everything is square. I got this little square from Twisted Hobbies. Now we're finding the fuselage stiffeners. And we're going to be cutting the vertical fuselage open a little bit in order to get into there. It's kind of a tight fit because you're going down between multiple pieces that you've just glued together. But I get it in there and kind of pull it apart. Squeeze some glue in. And then making sure from both sides. This is also a good time to think about when you have adhesive on your fingers and you touch the graphics, it'll pull it off. So I really try to get to it before it gets tacky on my fingers. So I try to wipe it off. That way I don't end up messing up my graphics. Not that I've done that before, being such an expert at building. Okay, now we're on to wings. So double the wings, double the fun. This is my first biplane, so I'm pretty excited about it. Pulling all the pieces from inside that need to get pulled out, and then I do a test fit. I always do a dry fit, because if you don't, it will backfire on you, and it won't quite fit in there, and you'll have glue all over it and all over your hands. So I always do the test fit, or dry fit, whatever you want to call it. So I push these together, making sure they're nice and tight. And also you'll notice I'm doing this on top of that parchment paper. After something like this, I usually swap it out or just make sure that the glue is dried enough so that it doesn't stick to the bottom of something else later on. And we're also going to glue in the strut spars. For these, when I get them together, I'm going to grab some pins to push them together. And now we're going to grab our horn set and start working on all of our horns. So I cut them all out at one time and then sand them up a little bit, get rid of all the burrs. And then we'll be gluing on the aileron differential horn and the extenders for the elevator and rudder servos. So I get all of them done. Now I'm going to glue these up, and we'll start with the differential horn. Nothing too complicated here, just getting some glue onto it, making sure it's got a little fillet. And then we're going to work on putting the end links on the ailerons. So I set these out and made sure I was going to put it through the right direction. And then when I actually did both of them, I realized that I had one on the wrong direction. So I had to take it back off and put it on again. I think you'll see that coming up. Yep, I had to remove it. It was kind of a hassle to remove. They're not supposed to remove. So had to go through the other way. Here's a little bit of detail on how to deal with these. If you grab it with just the edge and then use your pliers and your fingernail to push down, then these go on pretty well. Also using the table and pushing down on top of them. There we go. So now I have all those extenders. Now we're going to work on our gang horns for our ailerons, and they will tie the ailerons together. And we're just making sure that those are in there flush. Make sure you get foam tack on both sides, or whatever preferred adhesive you're using. And it's the same thing for both the top and bottom wing. Then we're going to move on to the aileron horns. And you just need to make sure you've pushed them all the way back. On these ones, you really got to make sure they're not extending out too far, because you do want them right over the top of that hinge line. Then you got to cut this all the way through when you put it in. And if you notice, I just went for it. I didn't dry fit it. I should have dry fit it first. I said I always dry fit. I do, I swear. So we're moving on to the aileron servo. We got to get the cutout for that. We got to open it up just a little bit. Then we're using our balsa stiffeners for the upper and lower wings. Just make sure you're using the right ones on the top and bottom. And also make sure that these actually get cured and are not going to move around when you try to put on your wings, because you want them in place. So make sure that you give them time to set up. I gave it time. It just doesn't look like it because I work so fast. Had to extend this just a little bit, because once you put those balsa stiffeners in there, then it's a little bigger. So a little guess and check until you get it just right. And that looks like it's a great fit. Get the glue on all the surfaces. I'm also measuring from the tip of the wing to the tip of the elevator, making sure that it's all square, or at least it's the same length on both of those, because you don't want to glue it on there cattywampus, make your plane fly sideways all the time. Then we're putting in the struts between the wings. They do go forward from bottom to top. They lean forward. So as I'm putting this together, it's upside down and everything. So it's, you got to kind of think through that, where you're going to put those before you glue them in. And this is an optional thing for the aileron differential horn. I had a spare piece of carbon fiber, and I just drilled a little hole into it with my pin vise and pinned it with the carbon fiber piece. This isn't required. Some people will drill and put a little screw through there. Some models, they have that in the manual. On this manual, they didn't have that in there. But I like it to be a little extra secure. Some people even use some thread and then lock it in with CA glue. This is a place where I did use a little bit of CA. I really like the foam tack for most of the plane, but there are some places that have hard connections that I like to use the CA glue for. Now we're going to cut apart the side force generators and glue on the rudder. Got to make sure that it's on there straight. You also have to be careful because the plane does rest on the rudder, so I propped it up a little bit in the back with those side force generators. That's why I cut those apart when I did. Then I put on the canopy for the fuselage. That's a piece that I'm always grabbing when I grab the plane out of the air. Now I'm scuffing up the motor mount to give it a good place to adhere. And then sticking it on, getting it all centered. Putting in the aileron servo. Then putting on the aileron differential horn. Make sure that the crescent shape faces forward. This is a little tough to get into because they have you put it in there and then sort of tilt it to the side to screw down the horn onto the servo. And now we're going to be making all of our linkages. Setting up my heat shrink, setting up my carbon fiber rods, setting up my end links. I think they give you a couple extra end links, but I've never really had to use them. So I'm gluing these together with a little bit of foam tack, and then we're going to heat up the heat shrink, and then I'm going to use some CA glue on them as well. So there's the heat shrink part. Be careful because you can melt the end links, so only give it enough to tighten up that heat shrink. And it's just a little pinch to get those onto there. Sometimes it's a little more than a pinch and you have to roll it around a little bit. So it looks like we've got the aileron linkages done, and now we're working on the end links for the elevator and rudder. Again, if you push these down onto the table, it seems to work really well. Getting those into place, getting them adjusted. And then working on the push rods for the aileron and the elevator. Make sure you get it through the front end link before you clip it into the aileron's horn, because otherwise you'll have to take it back out. Not that I've ever done that before. And then finding the little holes for these is a little bit of a hassle, but once you figure out how far they are spaced out apart, then it's pretty straightforward to push them into place. I like to use foam tack for this. Not a whole lot, just a touch on each. And then you'll notice here, I did mess that up. I had to take it off in order to feed it through. So I'm getting that end link attached. This one's giving me a little trouble, but not too bad. Making sure they're all aligned. I'm looking down all those push rod guides to make sure that they're all aligned and there's none that are binding up. Aileron gang control rods. Same process here for getting the end links on, getting the heat shrink. They have a measurement in there that they mention in the manual. I had to trim mine just a little bit, but that seemed to be the correct length. Also, make sure on these when you are putting them together that you are facing both end links in the same direction, because you don't want one rotated. They should both be going the same way. You can see here I'm doing the trimming on those. And then applying the CA glue. I'll set those aside and then start on the side force generators. And then we'll install those into the aileron gang horns. Next we'll be mounting the motor and the ESC into the plane. Pretty straightforward here. And then we're going to be putting on the side force generators, but I would actually hold off on this because after this we do the landing gear and the plane needs to be upside down, and I kind of squashed my side force generators that were on the top of the wing there. So I'd hold off on these until the very end. So now on to landing gear. With the landing gear you gotta mark your center for these, and I just measure it, divide by 2, and then scratch a little target. I use the pin vise to drill a tiny hole and get it started, and then I use progressively bigger drill bits with the drill. Helps to have some new drill bits that are nice and sharp. And then we're going to be doing a little assembly for each wheel. You put the screw through. Well, first you drill out the wheel, then you put the screw through, and then a nut, and then I put some CA glue onto that, and then that goes through the fiberglass supports, which I would probably paint if I were to do this again. I'd paint them beforehand to match the plane. Then, those of you who are smart have probably noticed that I messed something up at this point. I've got these all glued on and held in place perfectly, and then I realized I wasn't going to be able to put that on the plane. So then I had to undo a few things. Took off the wheel in order to get it through the fuselage. On the fuselage there's like 4 little dots that show you where it's going to be going through. So you just cut that open, feed it through, and then I had a hard time getting this piece all the way in, so I actually had to sand it a little bit in order to be able to squish it onto the fuselage. Actually, I had to sand it quite a bit. So I'm getting all that tightened back on, and then I'm going to glue the wheel spats on top of those fiberglass struts that are next to the wheels. I don't really use these as actual landing gear. Usually I just like hover and flop it down from a Harrier, or I do a hover catch. But it does help a lot to have them for visual orientation of which way the plane's going, because this plane loves to roll, and without knowing which way you're going, it makes it a little harder. So having those to visually show you helps a lot. I got these centered and then glued into place. Use that O-ring installation tool to get it on there. I really struggled with that before I had that tool. Then I'm getting all my electronics glued on in place and all my servo wires hooked up. At this point I'm not organizing them yet. I'm just making sure everything's working right. Getting it all hooked up to the receiver. Getting a battery put onto it, checking it. It's all looking like it should. Had to do some adjustment here and there. I didn't tighten down one of the push rods, so I had to fix that up, fix my side force generators, make sure they're all stuck in there correctly, and then the plane's done. I really enjoyed this build. Twice the wings is definitely twice the fun. Finishing it up, I put on a little bit of Velcro for the battery. I set my CG on the top wing right along the hinge line. I put on my contact info and my FAA registration number. And I put a little drop of CA glue on the end of each of the push rods. I then glued in each of the servos permanently, and then trimmed off any excess push rod. I mounted the receiver wires, one going straight upright, the other going along the fuselage. And then I added a little piece to the tail section because I wanted the carbon fiber to hold the rudder off the ground. Tucked all my wires into the fuselage connection piece to keep it all neat and tidy, and then I'm done. This is a fantastic plane. It's become my favorite plane, and that is my build of the Crack Pitts. I hope you guys enjoy it.